I have the great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Ernesto Pujol, who's the Keith and Katherine Sachs professor for this year. Um, Ernesto Pujol's work has always been about expanding democratic space such that the politics of process is of equal importance and value to the politics of ends. How one speaks to another as an individual, the dialogue with an MFA student, for example, is as important as what one says, which is as important also as how one listens and how one heeds what is being said. His art, in other words, is continuous with his being. He nurtures ideas from disparate sources and assembles them into a coherent whole, even if temporarily. Body, mind, action, and spirit flow into one another, generating sensations of performativity and multidimensional consciousness from self to other. If I may be allowed to make certain assertions about Ernesto's work, I would say this. In his work, there are no separations between self and other. There are no antipodes that distend supposition from application. There are no sublational binaries such as the distinctions between art and life. There is no meaning to art without ethics or politics. Through the interactions of bodies or his own body, Ernesto's precisely choreographed performances express concern for a wide range of more themes: individual identity, community formation, circumscriptions of gender, official versus collective memory, processes of becoming, a la Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the continuousness of humanity with the rest of nature, politics and war, death and loss. These past couple of years, I've had the pleasure of introducing Ernesto Pujol to an audience once before, but in that earlier time, I did not know him as well. While I have long appreciated Ernesto's work, I've since become even more of a fan now that I know him a bit better, not least because so many MFA students have told me persistently how much their thinking about their own work have been deepened after an encounter and conversation with Ernesto. Several students have commented about Ernesto's ability to accumulate on what they really want to say. Ernesto has a way of understanding someone else's interiority. While I was elated when Ernesto agreed to be our Sachs professor, I am especially grateful that he is the Sachs professor during this most challenging of years. His sensitivity, his kindness, his calming and generous spirit is precisely what we all need at this time. Ernesto has garnered many official accolades, including awards from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, the Synthesis Foundation, and the Joan Mitchell Foundation. He has served as Distinguished Artist Fellow at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, taught at Cooper Union Pratt Institute, School of Visual Art, and the Rhode Island School of Design, among others. His performances and installations have taken place at the ICA, Boston, PS1 in New York, Miami Art Museum, Van Abbe Museum, Holland, the second Johannesburg Biennial, which, by the way, Ernesto, I was also in, and I regret we never met on that occasion, and the sixth Havana Biennale, among many, many other citations. It's my pleasure to welcome Ernesto Pujol to you today, and please everyone give Ernesto Pujol a warm welcome.
Thank you, Ken. That was incredibly generous. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone in the program. You have been so welcoming, so supportive during a very challenging year, challenging first and foremost to you, and then obviously to me as a newcomer coming in, trying to learn the ropes very quickly. And integrate even long distance. So you have made what would have been otherwise a very bumpy challenging, difficult relationship, very smooth, very warm, very familial. I regret that that the Sachs professorship this year was indeed a zooming professorship. I so wish that we could have been physically present to each other, as a performance artist, as a social choreographer. But adaptation is the key to survival, and so here we are. I thought that for this Sachs lecture, because this lecture happens in the context of an art program that trains young artists into the dawn, the portal of practice, of a lifelong practice, that I would do something a little different, that seeking some kind of intimacy through this medium, that I would trace a bit my own journey performatively, not out of a narcissistic intent, but simply trying to be transparent and to share as much as I can about what is often a very blind journey down a hallway that you don't know where it leads. You're just hoping to take ethical steps, intuitive steps, truthful steps. So I'm going to share my screen and begin to do a slideshow. And I've called it a history of walking because on the road to enactment, I came to performativity fairly late, 25 years ago, which may sound like a long time to those who are young, but not to me. And I came of age as an installation artist, that second Johannesburg biennial that Ken spoke about, and I am sorry that we did not meet then, had me there representing the US as part of a small delegation, also with Pepon Osorio and others. Had me there as an installation artist. But over the years, friends like Coco Fusco and Tania Bruguera challenged me. I was always creating stages for people to enter and inhabit and thus activate. And they challenged me to activate them myself, to perform in my own stages, ephemeral. And so I began mostly at first with performative photography, going back to a kind of classicism that I had learned in art school, master painting, European painting, Counter-Reformation Spanish painting, of which these performative photographs are documents. Zurbarán, Velázquez, and that kind of output. And they were allowing my body, which was a very shy and timid body, to enter public space by sending out my images before I actually physically entered. And then I began to enter, and this was the Spoleto Festival in 2005, doing a walk through Magnolia Cemetery, a walk of empire. And it is a solo piece. I began to perform solo, not for long. I very quickly sought a performative collective and what I call social choreography. But at first, I had to learn how to walk. I had to learn how to walk public space. And it's funny how when we teach ourselves how to walk as toddlers, as our parents watch with fear, hoping we don't hit anything. But when you walk consciously, when you walk mindfully, it's almost like you have to teach yourself how to walk again. And so this was a Southern Confederacy cemetery filled with Confederate flags, monuments to the antebellum South, to Jacksonville, and it was amazing to walk them, following the photographs that were taken during the Civil War of the soldiers, of missionaries, and reading the letters of Walt Whitman as a nurse who served as a nurse in Washington, D.C. to the wounded. And so this was a performative solo walk that was later presented as an installation. I was still mixing mediums with words cast in glass, framed in a 19th century way from those very letters of Walt Whitman. And so images and words and some other pieces of archaeology of the performance formed the installation, which was shown at Lightwork Visual Studies. And then from having created stages to learning how to walk and teaching myself how to walk publicly, to beginning to develop a menu of gestures. I really didn't have anything to perform. I thought I was a vessel of tools, a bag of tools, if you wish. This was at the Noguchi Museum in New York, and I was given access to the tools, the materials of Isamu Noguchi, and in fact, one of the last stone bells that he created before he died, which had never been rung. And I began to explore a gestural menu with friends. This is with Leslie Dill, who's mostly known as a sculptor and choreographer herself, but who I invited to perform with me. And we basically took an account of our breath. We faced each other over a long day, 6 hours of museum institutional life, unrolling these paper rolls and tracing our breath. And then in between breath, every so often we would stand up, ring the bell, and switch places, mixing our breath through the medium of drawing. And that was a great experiment in developing a first gestural menu. And then walking even more publicly, as Ken mentioned, at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, which opened this amazing building. The first summer it opened on the water. As you remember, the ICA had been in the heart of Boston and then moved to the water. And once you're inside the building, you feel this immersion. The building almost feels like it's falling into the water. And they commissioned me to do a piece about the relationship of the building with the water, the people of Boston, the city of Boston with the water. And I developed a pilgrimage to the water, where enacting a history of sailors, of fishermen, and women. I would start at the gallery. I did this for 5 months, and I visited one island per month. I would walk the length of the harbor, followed by people like a Pied Piper, and then take the ferry and go to one of there are 34 islands in Boston Harbor. This is a lighthouse that's actually active with the US Navy. And I would collect water. And to this day, I cast these bottles of glass in the shape of the islands. And I still have them. That is the very bottle I'm holding there, which almost 10 years later still has water from Boston Harbor, which is remarkable. And then I would collect water, a pilgrimage to water, and then bring it back to the museum where it was laid as an incremental sculpture over those 5 months. And then I began to work with people. It was great to explore the performativity of singularity, of the single author, teaching myself how to walk publicly, experimenting with a gestural menu that came from others, like inhabiting Noguchi's tools and materials and spaces, inhabiting the human residue of countless people who worked the Boston Harbor, but I really did not want that much attention on myself. I was not interested in that. I wanted to be lost within a community, a gestural community. And so this is Honolulu. 10 years ago, the Contemporary Museum invited me to hold a 10-year retrospective. So I had a decade show at the Contemporary in Honolulu, and then they commissioned a piece about the city of Honolulu. And after much research, actually 3 years of research, Hawaiian society being very rich in the mix of Native, the descendants of the Christian missionaries, many of them from Boston, coincidentally, that went there, and the British, of course, and then the Japanese, the Chinese, the Portuguese who came in to work the sugarcane and pineapple plantations. And so I trained a group of citizens, mixing bodies. Some of them were artists with very graceful trainings, but most of them were citizens with very pedestrian and accessible bodies. And after much research and dialogue with the Native community, who complained that most tourists did not see their island, we chose 12 neighborhoods that were historically significant to many of the constituencies that make up contemporary Hawaiian society. And we did a 12-hour walk from sunrise to evening, where these neighborhoods were revisited in silence by performers using the body of the artist as an excuse to revisit the landscape, the body of the artist as an excuse, if not the art as an excuse to seek deep presence and to seek memory and to seek the unfinished, the crimes of a place, the residue of a place. The piece was called Speaking in Silence because the Native community made it very clear to me, to us, that language was very important to them, that even though Native Hawaiian was not documented as a language, was not a written language until the missionaries came and wrote it down, if you will, so as to translate the Christian Bible for them and Christianize them. But ultimately, the Native community has taken that back, and language, Native language, is the site of resistance, is the site of Native identity. And there are a number of schools called the Kamehameha schools that teach that language to the future generations of Native descendants. And so we were outfitted with these beautiful little red books that contained thousands of Native words. And because of the belief that silence is not the absence of words, silence is the absence of distractions. So if you utter the right words, they feed your silence. They come from your silence and feed your silence and return to a richer silence. Then the performers were invited, this is Chinatown, Honolulu, to carry these books in their silent walks, but then to, at random, speak from them if they felt moved by people, if they felt moved by time of day, place, their own inner lives, their interaction with the people who followed them, and to utter a word in Native Hawaiian and then translate it as an act of generosity for that English-speaking audience. These are two performers, one Native, one Korean, Hawaiian, in front of Iolani Palace, the palace of Queen Liliuokalani, the last queen of Hawaii, a constitutional monarch deposed by a coup organized by US sugar planters and the US Navy. This is the monument to the fallen of the Pacific, which colonially sits on top of a native cemetery on top of a volcano, layering and layering. And then this was, again, in choreographing society, because I believe that, as some of my students know, you know, we're not politicians. We don't sign law, you know, statements into law. We are the people who create society one project at a time. That is our building of society, one artwork at a time. And so this is the Utah State Capitol, invited by the University of Utah, who received a huge grant from the family that launched Adobe software. And this was a piece, also the product of research, called Awaiting, about the kind of contract, mostly embodied and carried by women in the far West, of waiting, obediently waiting, the Mormon culture, the culture of the colonists who went out west out of faith, to work the land and hope that they were blessed and turned the desert into the Garden of Eden, if you will. And so this is a performance that lasted also a cycle of a whole 12-hour period, where the performers enacted the purity of waiting, the act of waiting. About 100 performers, 40 at their core, began to climb the state capitol from sunset, to sunrise the following day. A performance taken over by women, a performance that, even though I always do open calls, it was remarkable the amount of Mormon and ex-Mormon, and, as Mormons say, Gentile women that took it over as a feminist gesture, but also as a gesture of piety. This is from the hill at night. The remarkable aspect of that hill is that you can see the whole city, Salt Lake, from that hill, so that the performers and the participants get this view, which is remarkable, day and night. It was a nonstop walk, creating this space of silence to enact waiting. And then it was followed by a town hall meeting a week later at the Museum of Fine Arts of Salt Lake, where 40 plus performers spoke, broke their silence. This was also a silent piece, and spoke about enacting the act of waiting, which was so complicated for so many of them. Mormon women spoke about being proud of their waiting, about being proud of their obedience to bishops and ministers and husbands and fathers and brothers and uncles. A lot of women also spoke that they were done with waiting, that they left all their waiting on the hill, that they were never waiting for anything else in their lives, and that the hill was cathartic for them. My role is that of portraitist. I am not coming there as a queer artist, as a Latinx artist, as a New York-based, Philly-based, now San Juan-based artists to preach to them about what I think is right for them in terms of postmodernity, let's say, or human rights. I come to take a portrait as inclusive as possible of that is not judgmental. And so it's fascinating. This was in Germany at the Kunsthalle Osnabrück, a piece commissioned by German curator Julia Draganovic about the psychic burden of the German people after two 20th century wars, after taking on a huge Turkish community to replace the many German men and women workers who died, and now letting in the Syrian community. Germany has allowed in a huge population of Syrians. Why? You know, the baggage that older Germans in particular take. And so I devised a system of weights where a group of 23 German performers carry as much weight as their spinal columns allow without breaking or straining, because it was not meant to be an endurance piece. And so they are walking that Gothic space, which is now the Kunsthalle, on that medieval floor for 48 hours, nonstop, for 48 hours. On the second day, beginning to release what was their weight in sand, forming a river of fine white sand on that floor, a river of sand that stayed on as a sculpture, as an installation for a week after the piece was done. It was a remarkable piece about invisibility, about the kind of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorders that we carry. There were great conversations leading up to the piece by older Germans, their memories as children of the war, the shame of having grandparents and even parents, some of the older ones who were officers, and how do they atone for that now? This was 2007 at the Chicago Cultural Center, a piece co-hosted by the Chicago Cultural Center and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago during 2007, our involvement in the Middle East, a piece about mourning under that Tiffany roof, which was a mausoleum to the fallen during the Civil War, after the Civil War, the US Civil War. And we embodied, it has a kind of contemporary mourning. It has an amazing chest-like floor of lighted squares, and we made use of that to light the performers, simply using the architecture as they moved from square to square between the sound of bells for a 9-hour day. This was crossing the line shortly after Hurricane Sandy, which was so destructive to New York City, the flooding. Crossing the Line is a festival curated by the French Institute, Alliance Française. And so using a stone from the Hudson, we inhabited St. Paul's Chapel, moving like water, water that whirls as it seeks a point of exit. So one performer starts, in this case me, followed by a second performer, followed by a third performer, until the neoclassical hall is slowly filled by 40 performers who walk nonstop, 24 hours, but they walk a circle and they walk backwards. What you don't see is that they're actually walking backwards. which puts the body in a vulnerable position. It does not see where it's going. How do you get 40 people to walk backwards in a space that is perhaps 30 by 30 feet? It makes you look down, seeking empty space. It humbles the vision. The only way to seek not crashing with other bodies is to actually seek empty space on the floor. Seek to be, if you will, like water that flows between rocks. 40 performers, one at a time enters, and then one at a time leaves. 24 hours later until one is left, just as we began. 9 to 5 was an interesting experiment. It was hosted by More Art, an amazing public art, contemporary public art organization in New York. I now serve on the advisory board. It was right across the street. The performance that I curated for them was right across the street from the 9/11 memorial, a very charged site at Brooksfield Arts. This opening is one of the major hubs of people coming into the city from New Jersey and from Upper Manhattan. Thousands and thousands of people come out every morning. And I set up a listening school, which I call 9 to 5. So for 3 days, we sat in these glass cubicles that were not glass cubicles. I turned them into glass cubicles. They're basically architectural contraptions holding up the glass wall. But I turned them into these sites for perception. 11 performers sat for 3 days, 9 to 5, listening, seeing, being there, and writing non-judgmentally what they saw, what they heard. And then after 3 days, we eventually published a selection of their writings, which were remarkably about love. We did not set out to have an agenda. I simply gave instructions. I'm very interested in a performativity that blurs the boundary between the process of making art and the work of art itself, and also a performativity where we learn. Historically, the artist speaks, the audience listens, the work of art speaks, the public listens. But what if the artist was a public servant of listening? What if the work of art was a vessel recording listening live, through analog, through the hand, through the ear, through the eye, through the body? And so that was the first listening school. And then I developed a piece called The Listeners, which was first curated back in Germany at the Peace Festival at the town hall of the cities of Osnabrück and Münster, in the very hall where the Peace of Westphalia, the Westphalian Peace Treaty, was signed, ending the 30-year war between Catholics and Protestants, where 1/6 of the German population died. And so the performers were able to sit in this very medieval hall, dressed in blue. I always uniform the performers. We don't have a sense of uniforms anymore. The people who seem to wear uniforms are our janitors, our nurses. I need the performers to be seen. I seek to be unspectacular, engaging in durational art that cannot be consumed in a few minutes, the way that you walk into a gallery and see 12 paintings or sculptures in minutes, if not seconds, and walk out thinking you've seen it. And so the durational fights that. that kind of cultural consumerism. This was a piece that, if you wish to see it, you had to make a contract with the docents, and then come into a room where the listener sat, and choose a listener, perhaps who spoke your language. We had about 11 languages in the room. Or perhaps you chose a listener who did not speak your language because you needed to release something, to release it like a piece of material, almost dense in its weight, in its psychic weight, but you need for it to remain a secret. And I actually had that experience of Germans who came to me because I only spoke English, Spanish, and French. I did not speak German. And they spoke to me, they told me, I have chosen you because you don't speak German. And then they launched into a narrative, crying or laughing or being very serious, and then thanked me back in English and walked away, having released something publicly and with another body, to another body. And so you came in, you chose a listener, you spoke for however many hours or minutes you wished, and then you left. The listener said, thank you, I have listened to you. Thank you for speaking to me. And the listener walked you out of the room after that, out of the belief that so many people walk around feeling unheard. And then this was the waiting, the queue outside that room. They're going in through the door that you see to your right. The door to the left is how people exit one at a time. They go into the right one at a time. You could not see it, consume it. You could only participate, engage. And then we did the Listeners New York as part of the River to River Festival, curated by Lily Chopra of the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, where I went further. I'm always still, experimenting with performativity. I'm still a student of performance. I'm still learning how to perform in the world. And so I did a training on listening with my performers, but then we spent 3 days in the streets of Manhattan as listeners, labeled as listeners, which is a lot of accountability to take that on, to proclaim yourself a listener. How dare you? What skills do you have that you can call yourself a listener? So my listeners spoke, did research, which looked like a performance. Perhaps it was a performance. I'm not interested in that question of whether this was a performance or not. It was performative. They spent 3 days in the streets of the city, speaking with people with a set of questions that we had discussed about listening, what constitutes a good listener. And then we ended up with yet another formal moment here in the city, where, as in Germany, you came into this space, this really gorgeous space, where Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States. You picked a listener out of this circle and you spoke for as long as you wished. I've done particular experiments in performativity. This was in Istanbul at the Istanbul Modern, shortly after the first protests that marked the crisis of democracy in Turkey, with a Turkish company that no longer exists, sadly, precisely because of that conflict, founded by Jeffrey Baikal Rowlands, an amazing American artist, then living in Istanbul, teaching at Robert College. The piece combined the mourning of the protests with the rage of that people experience after being violated. And then with that same group, we went to Venice to reveal the Turkish inheritance of the Levante period in Italy. How the Crusades stole so much Turkish know-how. And we inhabited St. Mark's Square and revealed that the flooring of St. Mark's Square is actually the Turkish design of a classical traditional Turkish carpet called the keyhole design. And we walked it. And then theatricality, which, you know, even though I can be very formal in a kind of poetic, metaphorical rendering of performing a place, this was in Kansas with someone who is actually part of this audience tonight, poet Lori Brack. This was at the Salina Arts Center, an amazing contemporary arts center in the heart of Salina, which is the heart of Kansas, which is the heart of the continent, meaning, not the continent, I'm sorry, the North America. And this is poet Lori Brack, one of my favorite and most remarkable contemporary American poets, a great Kansas poet. And then to the right, another great collaborator, Priti Gulati Fox, an Indian artist residing in Kansas because of her husband, who's a scientist working with the Land Institute, restoring the native ecosystem of the Midwestern prairie. This was a beautiful piece where families allowed us to, somehow I bumped out. Oops, sorry about that. Let me get out. And Kansas families allowed us to borrow all these implements that their great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, parents had used in small family farms, the vanishing American family farm. And there we are. And so there was a central table and then a group of men and women that rose, and the instruction was pick a utensil, a tool from the table, and enact it in this former grain storage space right by the tracks, the railroad tracks. People came to watch us all night long. It was called Farmer's Dream because the farmers have a right to dream even to this day with the vanishing farms. And it was an amazing collaboration with Kansas-based artists. I seem to be getting bumped up because it's the last slide. Okay. So, so that is a sampling. There's 30 years of projects. It's hard to pick a selection for this remarkable group, but it's been a school. Performativity, from its singularity to its collectivity, has been a remarkable school. Performing society, being commissioned by institutions that are the gatekeepers and stakeholders of place to research people and place and develop a piece that is welcoming to mainstream audiences, to people who might not go to museums, so that the art is coming to them on the streets, where they see themselves being performed some aspect of their lives. And I'm still learning how to do it, and still experimenting with the boundary between the artist and the civilian, the work of art and daily life, and the merging of all that. I'm very happy to hear your comments, take questions, and so on from this point on. I know that Amrita is going to do the Q&A. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. That was so brilliant, and we're so special. It's so lucky to have you here. Yeah, people can just unmute and ask questions or put them in the chat, either or.
Hi, everyone. Ernesto, thank you so much for this survey of your projects. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the choice of vestments that you've had throughout all of these projects. There's a slight variation. There's not just in color, but texture, fabric. But can you just tell us a little bit about the choice of this type of vestment?
Sure. Public art, as you know, particularly performance art, public art is grossly underfunded, since it has no product to later give it to a marketplace and contribute to the gallery economy. And so very early on, I decided to create wardrobes in a rather populist way, so that I wanted uniforms to single out performers as engaged in some kind of metaphoric labor. And very early on, what I began to do and continue to do is that we have a wardrobe day when we choose the color for that specific performance, the monochromatic color that creates a sense of a uniform. All the performers and their families and friends basically bring clothing of that color. We set it out on a clean floor, and we then walk around and begin to choose things, borrowing from each other, and trying them on until collectively we begin to bond visually, until we begin to look like a company in that traditional sense. And so it's a fairly simple and generous, profoundly generous project. Once in a while, I have a budget and I take myself to the Salvation Army or somewhere like that, which has fairly accessible secondhand clothing, also seeking to recycle. And then I bring in loads of things. If that is the case, then that clothing is a gift to the performers, and they keep it. And if it is not wanted, it goes back and it's donated again. But it's a fairly simple process based on an economy of gift giving, really.
Ernesto, thanks very much for your beautiful talk. I wonder whether you could speak a bit more about the meaning of walking, because walking slows down time. Walking is also, I think, for anyone who's been to poor parts of the world, is what you do, right? Because you don't have cars, so it's a metric of social class, often poverty, otherness. People who don't have cars, even in Philadelphia, for example, they wait for the bus, they walk just to
Yeah.
save a bus token, and so on. So I wonder if you could just kind of speak about that relationship, because in your work in terms of walking.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Walking is an amazing common denominator, and because I seek more often than not to work with what I call civilians, non-artists. You know, walking is the common language that we speak, and so very early on, it became the glue of the performances. I mean, personally, I'm an admirer of the great walkers of let's say modernity. You know, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, all these leaders who, out of colonized environments, in oppressed environments, chose to walk, to be seen, to be present, to dare cross the landscape that was said not to belong to them, that they were not allowed to inhabit, but could only be at the margins. You know, the way that African Americans had to get off the sidewalk if a white body was coming down, and so there is this great lineage to walking and political activism, and peace, a peaceful confrontation, if you will. But it's also a great common denominator, and so it's been the glue of most projects, combining it also with stillness, because we do live in a culture of speed, a culture that worships speed, and so it is walking with countless pauses, but it is a slow walking, as you said, and when you slow walk and then pause, to rest, to breathe, to see, to hear more, you do have a sense of the slowing down of time. You're not rushing, you're not running, pursuing something career-wise or out of anxiety. And all the more so when the walking happens within the arc of nature, so that it's marked from sunrise to sunset, from sunset to sunrise, so that it's also walking with light over the absence of light, or seeking light, waiting for the light, or seeking darkness after being under the sun. So that kind of slow walking filled with moments of stillness within the arc of nature is a very different experience of time, as well as knowing that once you begin walking, you have 12 more hours or 10 more hours of walking. And so there's no rush, because you have 12 hours of walking ahead, and you need to economize the biologic body's energy. So that is true. That's very perceptive. I want to answer also a question that just came in this chat, about limited budgets and if I pay performers. Depending on the budget, I pay performers when there is a budget that pays performers. So often there's a budget that barely pays for the production. And so I try to create a system whereby people are paid not just through stipends, if there are stipends to give out, but also through, let's say, we have a host that is a museum, through free museum memberships, through memberships to contemporary art centers or galleries. I seek some kind of package, that remunerates the performer in some way. Those of us who are artists who collaborate with me, I seek to promote their work in some way, publishing what they're writing, publishing what they're composing as musicians. If I can, you know, in the days of CDs, burn CDs for them and promote them and sell them with 100% of the sale going to them. So it's a case-by-case scenario in the US where public art is grossly underfunded. There was another question also, if I would be willing to talk about conceptualizing the school and the school as understood by you. Very early on, when I began to do open calls, these performances are not recruited through by invitation only. I kind of, you know, put them out on a limb and do open calls through all kinds of partners, cultural partners of place, and then do these first sets of readings where the very proposal that I submitted to the funder and the host institution, the university, museum, or so on, is read out loud so that there is no secrecy or mystery, and there's full transparency and full accountability. And out of those open calls and open readings, people self-select. There's also conversations, and then a series of very formal, very disciplined, very rigorous trainings happen. And after doing that for a first set of group performances, people began to speak of them being like schools. Schools not just of performativity, but of history, of memory, of place, of psychology, of sociology, of anthropology. And so I was given the term, you know, that these workshops were like small schools, field schools, and I began to use it. And so the listening school is a field school. It's a tent that has no real estate, that has more of a psychic, you know, layer reality, and it appears when it is called upon by people and place through a project. And it seeks to be more than just, I'm going to teach you how to perform this, but it's more like we are going to learn about this place, its history, its people, its landscape, before, during, and after a colonizing presence. And we're going to teach each other because you are the born and raised. I'm more often than not the newcomer, the visitor. Of course, another question is that the tool bag, I mentioned being a tool bag, is also content. There's no question that I, even though I say that I have nothing to perform because, you know, so many people define art as self-expression, as the telling of a biography, of an autobiography. I basically bring a set of tools, the tool of walking, the tool of stillness, the tool of listening, the tool of stillness, the tool of gesturing minimally. And so, yes, that is content. There's no question that that is content. There's no question that I believe that listening is the foundation of democracy. There's no question about that. And I'll repeat it. I believe that listening is the foundation of democracy. And there's no question to me that silence is the foundation of listening. You cannot listen to anyone unless you are selfless, humbly quiet for a moment. withholding your narrative for a moment so that someone else can speak, have a voice. And there's no question that these tools are content, that in a culture of winners where everyone is terrified to be a loser, the tool of stillness is, devastating. To suddenly be still, is devastating. I mean, we just went through COVID, where a lot of people fell apart because they have no tools with which to inhabit solitude and silence anymore. We have lost the existential skill of inhabiting silence and inhabiting solitude, and we need to reclaim those psychic skills. So yes, you're absolutely right. Those were all the questions in the chat. I welcome more or also spoken questions. And thank you for those great questions. Oh, Riva, hello. Thank you so much for being part of this. Riva Weinstein, a wonderful artist who was one of the listeners in the New York edition of the listeners, sitting in that circle and spending 3 days in the city on the streets. Thank you, Riva.
Yes, so I'm just going to pop on to say hello and goodbye, Ernesto. Happy birthday.
Love you tons.
Ernesto, do you have ideas about video recording that in terms of these performances, or in terms of the relationship between the live performance and recording, that you must have thought about it a lot?
Yeah. Again, because of limited budgets, the issue about a recording is all that happens afterwards when you have, when you do a 30-hour, 40-hour performance, you have 40 hours of recording. And to go through the editing of that, that is a whole budget, and so there are videos of some of these pieces. If you go to YouTube and Vimeo and Google my name, if I may say that, you will find some videos of some of these performances, videos of minutes and videos of an hour or more. But I have left that to institutions and how institutions document their own programming. I simply seek through a corps of volunteer photographers who I train so as to not be intrusive, so as not to consume the audience, so as to employ long distance lens and whatever they photograph, and only for moments, not all day, do it at a distance, unobtrusively. So basically I've concentrated on just creating still images, which I activate through a moment like this one right now. I would love for more of these projects to generate video, but generating video is expensive, honestly. And I create ephemeral companies where I come to a place, I research the place, perhaps over years. I spend months in the place producing, and then unfortunately, there's hardly ever any budget for continuity. I mean, over the years, I have tagged along town halls to these performances, seeking a moment of coming back together now as civilians, as citizens, and saying, what just happened here? What was that? And the performers, who were usually silent or speaking in a very minimal, curated way during the performance, speaking about their experience, you know, because they are members of that very community. What they feel to perform themselves, their community, where they live, and so on. I love video. I would love to be able to produce more, but sadly, it's financially very challenging. Yeah.
I wondered because I thought that there's a different dynamic with photography in terms of
Yeah.
its quietness, and
Yeah.
and it might relate more to your performance experience, unless the film was made in a way that was, you know, from the perspective of the performance adjusted in some way.
Right.
So there seems to be some kind of dynamic with photography that's connected to the performance.
Right. Definitely. The photography is trying to give you some sort of spirit of the performance. The performances are messier, though I want to say that not by much, because even though there's no orchestra as in theater, you know, the orchestra being that boundary between stage and audience at the seat, there is something about the body walking slowly in silence that generates a really thoughtful distance with the viewer, even if the viewer is following that body. It's more often than not that silence is contagious, and we are in silence and the viewers become silent with us. You know, particularly in a performance of 8 hours where perhaps viewers come and they are excited and talkative with each other, also greeting friends, and the performance has a very deep stomach like a whale. It can take an hour of sound, if not noise, but then 2 hours later, it still has 5 hours to go. And people have quieted down and they're silent with us. And so I would say that the photographs are fairly representative of what happens. And the more I blur the boundary between the training for the performance, for the more formal so-called performance, and the process of getting there, probably the more messier they will get. But there's still something about mindfulness in even that, in throwing your body into the streets of Manhattan and speaking with people for 3 days. You're not selling ice cream or giving it away. You're not entertaining anybody. You know, neither the formal performance or the informal process of researching performatively and getting to the performance, there's never entertainment. And so there is always this sobering relationship with audiences that create something that you are reading in the photographs, I would say. But check out the videos. I mean, obviously video is edited. You can make video also in that sense be like a very still photograph, very poetic, very filled with spaces and silences. Even the people who have recorded video, I have asked them not to film the audience. I respect too much people in place. I don't want to consume my own audience later to prove that I had a huge audience, you know, of hundreds or thousands. I just want to give you the performer, and you are now the audience. You, this viewer right now, you are now the audience. Not watching another audience watch the performer. No, you're getting to watch the performer just like that audience to some degree.
I think there's a couple more questions in the chat. There's one from Renee that I think you kind of touched on a little bit already in terms of the amount of time and research, but maybe Renee, did you want to elaborate on that a little bit more, or?
Yeah, I guess I think it's fascinating because I know some of them, like the Hawaiian one. I heard you say once that you took a whole year to do the research, but I'm wondering how much that varies from budget and place.
You know, programming, like all programming, you know, when you are commissioned to do a piece, it's not overnight. You get commissioned a piece to do a piece 6 months from now, easily a year or two from now, particularly the bigger the institution, the longer the programming life. And I'm glad for that, because to research the ecology of a place, the human ecology, the so-called natural ecology, takes months, if not years. And so, yes, and I have to say, it's a process that is free. Nobody pays you for this. You get commissioned to do a piece when you're doing the piece there, but the 1 or 2 years of research is in kind, and it is very challenging, in fact. You know, I'm commissioned a piece, if I were commissioned a piece tonight, between now and a year from now, all that research is on my dime, and so it's a tough practice in that sense. I'm sorry that I'm slowly throwing a shadow. It's dark. I was in natural light. There's also another question here about the process involved in composing ephemeral companies. You know, I again, very early on in the practice, which I want to share with you because you are all developing these young practices out the door. I learned very quickly, you know, that I had to be able to shrink and expand the practice as economic downturns came, as projects were well funded or not, and as funding was sought and achieved or not, partially or fully. And so, but I also had this intention of the body in place, of the site specificity of my work. I didn't want to be a company coming from New York or Philadelphia or wherever, and then land there and show you these remarkably tall, graceful, you know, fit bodies that put everyone to shame, you know, and then I leave, and so I developed the concept of ephemeral companies, where I would come to engage, recruit people of that place to perform themselves in that place. It was conceptually intentional, but also economically sustainable as a practice. Yeah.
Ernesto, I love the way you speak about the rewards of walking slowly over time and in silence. And I guess I'm kind of, maybe I'm too much a victim of Hollywood movies, because I'm kind of tempted to think, well, Ernesto must have been some sort of fast track banker, and then one day he had a nervous breakdown and he realized, hey, I can't be on that lane anymore. I need to smell the roses and slow down and so on. I mean, I don't think that's the case. But is there a kind of, was there a moment of discovery or of the benefits of slowing down, of walking, of really looking at the world over time and so on, or were you always by nature that character that you are now?
You know, that's a great, thank you. That's a funny and great question. I'm definitely the result of my formation. I mean, my parents were young socialists. My mother was an educator, and when I was in art school, I've shared this before. with some of you. I was studying painting, sculpture, you know, the traditional mediums, and I had this conflict that that not everyone in the world had access to this or could even see it. And so I began to work as a volunteer with blind college students every afternoon who couldn't see the paintings that I was making and who couldn't touch the sculptures that I was making at a time when you couldn't touch anything in a museum. And I began to balance that very early on during my undergraduate years. And then after graduating from a BA in humanities with a major in fine arts, I went to a monastery where I spent about 5 years studying the monastic tradition. And then I went to work with the homeless and people with HIV/AIDS to complement what I felt was a very incomplete art training that only gave me residencies and internships in galleries and museums, not in farms and hospitals and community centers. And I lived in a homeless shelter for 2 years. And then I returned to the art world. So that between when I graduate from that BA in humanities and fine arts to that return to the art world, there's almost 10 years of giving myself an education in the human condition through interiority, the monastic tradition, which transcends Christianity. It's also Buddhist and Islamic, and so on, and Sufi. And then the cracks of the American mythology, you know, the homeless and the health system, the broken health system. And then I came back to the art world, and I also had to undo that, because at first I came back to very quickly being an artist with 6 galleries in 5 countries and biennials, and having to undo that. And I was very grateful for that. And a lot of people felt I was a fool for walking away from that. But choosing the provinces of the empire, very early on realizing that most of America lived between the coast, between New York and LA. Most of America lived in that in-betweenness where the so-called art centers were. And long before Trump, realizing that there was a white underclass, farmers and workers that were being betrayed by capitalism, the very system that had upheld democracy as a political system, as jobs fled. And so to answer your question, I've always been serious and boring, you know. It was my formation, never the life of the party, I'm sorry to say, but more of a, you know, kitchen, you know, I'm in the kitchen during the party and we're having a quiet conversation somehow on the side. But I've run, you know, I mean, it's contagious. The culture of speed, the fear of failure is contagious, the pressure to succeed. And I've had to redefine success, and I've had to redefine failure. True failure as a lack of accountability, violating ethics, and true speed as the urgency for consciousness. And so, you know, counterculturally redefining those things. Yeah.
Ernesto, I think you're anything but boring. I think maybe we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I have a final question, if I may. Ernesto, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about your experience with the the institution and performativity, and as it relates to your work in particular, and then perhaps sort of maybe contextualizing it with the other artists that you mentioned at the beginning, Coco, Tanya, Pepon, all of these individuals in sort of a, you know, can we contextualize it in a tradition, in a Latin American tradition, or not?
Yeah. When you said the institution, you mean institutions as a whole, museums, universities?
Yeah, I mean, the art institution, I guess, sort of outside of academia, when it's, you know, whether a museum or gallery.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very complex question what you're asking. Thank you for asking that. You know, I came of age, not, you know, during the multicultural years, the cultural wars, where it was great to finally be seen, began to be seen and began to be heard, but that was still very manipulated by mostly white institutions that, in order to continue receiving funding, they created a kind of quota system, mostly through the back door. We were coming into those institutions not through the curatorial departments, but through the education departments, not performing and installing. And I mean by that Pepon and Coco and myself and many others, not performing and installing in the main first floor galleries, but in the basements, in the kitchen, following the service, you know, dynamic of the Mexican American, the African American servant. They were very tough years where we were recruited to diversify and also to update, because many of us were dealing with the so-called new mediums, experimental media, you know, installation art in the 90s, performance art, video, photography beyond documentation, photography as art. So we were poster boys and girls, if not cultural ambassadors of something. There was a lot to negotiate. Many of us did not necessarily think of ourselves that way. We thought of ourselves as American artists, as global artists. Yes, perhaps also as Latin American or Central American, South American, Caribbean artists. There's also this simplification of the Latinx or Hispanics artist. You know, the Southern Americas are rich and complex. I think of myself more often than not as an islander, a Caribbean entity. As I was born in Cuba and raised in Puerto Rico, and have roots in Spain. It was tough. We were also invited to teach under the same terms by white programs with old guard white faculties, and yet incredibly diverse international student bodies that did not feel represented in those faculties. And so we would walk in and immediately experience a kind of civil war, academic civil war, and we would be bullied and policed by these faculties who resisted change, because we were the ambassadors of change, academic, but also hiring practice-wise. Even though we thought that there was space for everyone to sit at the table, they did not. So it's been a tough journey. You know, for me and for those who are not here, I think of Felix Gonzalez Torres, with whom I went to school, who the opposite, you know, nobody thought of his work as Latin American or Caribbean, but when I saw his skies, the open sky under the Atlantic, when I saw his candy, and if you come from a sugar growing country where sugarcane is the main crop in Cuba and Puerto Rico, where he was also born and raised like I was, you know that that work is encoded with Caribbean culture. But through metaphor, of course. So it's been challenging to deal with the labels, to also deal with the fact that the art world is profoundly secular. The art world that we know it is the product of modernity. Modernity is the product of secularism. The art world that we know is a religious-free zone that fears religion and any kind of spiritual practice as anti-intellectual, and I understand that fear, but most of humanity wakes up to religion every day as what rules their lives. Religion not as a faith system, but as a cultural product, like the Taliban in Afghanistan and other places. So it's been interesting to have to go against the grain of the American art world in so many ways to establish a practice that deals with humanity beyond the art world. That humanity that is conservative in so many ways, and to then deal with the labels that are really the product of capitalism. We label curatorially because we are the product of brand-seeking capitalism. We only know what we can brand. So our perception is deeply formed by capitalism.
Thank you, Ernesto. You're just, this is so great. Thank you for the generosity of spirit, of Gab, of just everything. Thank you.
Thank you for asking that. Well, it's 7:27. I assume we're getting close to the end. And I don't want to finish this. I thank the program, Ken, Leanne, Megan, Jackie, you know, I'm ready to adopt you as a sister, Jackie Tilston. But I also want to thank the students of this program, because at a kind of 6 minutes to midnight, I was invited, and I was thrilled to be invited to co-teach the critique class with Jackie. And it's been a wonderful experience. And I want to say that working with you all has been extremely meaningful. That, you know, I chose a long time ago not to seek tenure in any particular program, but really to walk, here I go, can walk through the North American academic system to experience contemporary art training in as many schools as I could. And I've experienced many a toxic environment in that sense. And so it's been great to work with you all for this semester, both as a Sachs visiting professor of fine arts, but also when I was a visiting critic that semester in that fall, right before COVID, little we knew. Thank you for the trust that all of you as students have placed on me, because I don't take education for granted. Every time you know, some young artist tells you about their work, they're really telling you about themselves. And that needs to be held on a silver platter. So thank you for the trust of sharing your processes with me. And this has been really a memorable experience.
Thank you so much, Ernesto.
Thank you. So Ken, you're the boss. You tell us what to do next.
It's turning into an Irish farewell. It's a,
Yes, yeah,
without the liquor, without the liquor.
yeah. Well,
Yeah. So, anyways, I think we look forward to the trip when it's happening. The department's committed to that, and we owe it to our students. We owe it to you as well, and so you know, it's just farewell for now. That's all. But thank you for a wonderful talk, and of course we'll stay in touch. And you're participating in the final reviews too.
yes,
You know,
yes.
students know that. So by popular vote, I tried to resist, but they kept twisting my arm. So so, anyways, thanks very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you all.